everyone! In this lecture, I'll talk about the requirements engineering process. Also, I'll present requirements elicitation and analysis. Processes used for requirement engineering vary a lot, depending on the application domain, people involved, and the organization that develops requirements. Requirement engineering process can be divided into four main groups: elicitation, analysis, validation, and management. In this context, elicitation means acquiring the requirements that are initially unknown. Imagine that we have requirements that are laying on the bottom of the sea, and we want to find and raise them on the surface. Requirements elicitation involves technical personnel working with customers to find out the application domain. Also, services that the system should provide and the system's operational constraints are involved. By the way, requirement elicitation may include end users, managers, engineers that are involved in maintenance, domain experts, trade unions, and others. All these people are called stakeholders. Actually, software engineers work with multiple stakeholders to fully understand the application domain, services that the system should provide, the required system performance, hardware constraints, and even other systems. The requirement elicitation process consists of four main stages. To make sure you will understand the elicitation process, I will visualize these stages schematically. First, we need to discover those requirements by interacting with different stakeholders. Domain requirements are also discovered at this stage. Then we can classify and organize them into coherent clusters to make sure that they are correctly prepared. The next step is to prioritize requirements, or in other words, highlight the most important ones, and negotiate them with customers. As you already know, different requirements may conflict with each other, especially when we have several stakeholders. So you have to know which ones are most important or necessary. And the last step is to perform the specification requirements. This means that we need to document them and pass them to the next round. I believe the main problems of requirement elicitation are pretty clear. Often stakeholders can describe only the final goal, and they really don't know what they actually need to reach that goal. And don't forget that stakeholders usually are not software engineers. They can be basically anyone, for example, lawyer, medic, and so on. So they express requirements in their own terms and language. Also, as I mentioned before, different stakeholders may have conflicting requirements. Multiple factors may affect the requirements, and they may change in the analysis process. For example, new stakeholders may appear, and the whole business environment can change. It is basically about gathering information about required and existing systems and sorting out the important information about users and the system itself. It requires interaction with different system stakeholders, from managers to external regulators. Interviewing, ethnography, scenarios, and other techniques are used to discover requirements. I will explain the main parts in more detail. Interviewing is the part where we communicate with stakeholders and try to understand system requirements. Interviews are good for getting an overall understanding of what stakeholders do and how they might interact with the system. Normally, there are two types of interviews: open and closed. Closed interviews are when stakeholders answer questions that are prepared in advance, while an open interview is when we have a live discussion. Interviewers need to be open-minded without preconceived ideas of what the system should do. Initiate an open discussion, and most likely you will find a surprisingly good solution. It is better to talk about the system by suggesting requirements rather than simply asking them what they want to or expect. Another important part is that both sides should be well prepared for the interview. In practice, a mix of different interview types is preferred. Of course, all interviews may have some issues. As I mentioned before, application specialists may use specific language to describe their work that isn't easy for engineers to understand. Usually, interviews are not very efficient to understand domain requirements because engineers cannot understand specific domain terminology. In some cases, the knowledge about domain is so familiar that it becomes hard to articulate. People may even think that it is not worth it to explain some parts of the system. Another type of discovery is ethnography. Ethnography is known as exploration of cultural phenomena. by observing the communities. For example, we observe various folk dances or traditions. In requirement engineering, it is almost the same thing. In order to determine requirements, we can follow how other people do their work, and they need to document all observations. In this process, people don't have to explain or articulate their work. Ethnography studies have shown that work is usually richer and more complex than it suggests by simple system models. Ethnography is effective for understanding existing processes but cannot identify new features that should be added to the system. The last type is stories and scenarios. It is based on the employees' stories about real-life examples of working processes, experiences, or any other related information. It is helpful because these stories are based on practical situations, and stakeholders can relate them or adjust to their situations and requirements. Key points of this lecture. There are different requirement engineering processes, but most of them use common activities: elicitation, analysis, validation, and management. Requirements elicitation and analysis cover discovery, classification and organization, prioritization and navigation, and specification. Interviewing, ethnography, scenarios are effective techniques that can be applied in practice. Thank you for your attention.